In this topic now, we'll be transitioning from the heart to the blood vessels. This is a model, actually it could be a real person of preserved blood vessels from Body World's traveling exhibit, showing the amazing amount of blood vessels that are present just in the neck and head, just incredible amounts of miles of blood vessels around the body. So as I've mentioned in a previous topic, we have arteries, along with the smaller arterioles that leave from arteries, capillaries, veins, and smaller venules that go back into veins. Let's talk about the features of these. So as I said before, AA, arteries away. There's no exceptions to this rule. All arteries in the body are transporting blood away from the inside of the heart, away from the heart chambers. Now usually, but not always, usually blood in arteries is oxygenated, meaning it's oxygen rich, it's high in oxygen. Now, after arteries, so it's alphabetical, ACV, blood travels into the capillaries. Capillaries are going to join these essentially smaller arteries called arterioles to these kind of smaller veins called venules. It connects the two. And more importantly, this is where diffusion happens. This is where all the nutrients, wastes, hormones, etc. are getting moved from the blood to the surrounding cells or vice versa. And then ACV, the veins, are always transporting blood back towards the inside of the heart, back towards the heart chambers. Now, usually again, but not always, usually blood in veins is oxygen poor. Even though, as I mentioned previously, all of our blood is red, just some is bright red and some is dark red or with a slight purplish hue to it, we do use red to indicate oxygen-rich blood and blue to indicate oxygen poor, even though our blood is not actually blue. Interestingly, there are some frogs that do have blue blood because instead of using iron for their transporter of oxygen like we do, they use copper, and copper gives it the blue color. Some other features we should know about comparing arteries, capillaries, and veins is how thick or how muscular their walls are. So arteries have the thickest walls of all. They're extremely muscular, able to withstand very, very high blood pressure, which we'll talk about later. Veins are the next thickest, but it's much thinner than arteries are. You can see in this picture, this real picture up here, arteries are very rounded and thick, kind of like a cord in a wall, where veins can be collapsed. They're much weaker. And then capillaries are the thinnest of all, in some cases only a single cell thick. They break very easily. When you get a bruise, it's because your capillaries burst and some blood leaks out. That's what a bruise is. It's blood that leaked out from broken capillaries. So let's talk more about each of these in turn. So arteries are able to stretch. Think about a balloon. You blow air into a balloon, it stretches. And unless you tie it off, that air is going to come back out. That's what's called recoil, where it's going to go back to its original state, or have that tendency to go back to its original state. And that's going to help to keep the blood moving, actually. As mentioned, they're very muscular, so they can withstand very high blood pressures and also can adjust to regulate blood flow by changing their diameter. Vasoconstriction over here in this picture means to get narrower, to constrict, like a boa constrictor tightens its prey. Vasodilation, to dilate, means to widen. That can affect blood pressure then. And branching off arteries, there's smaller things called arterioles that are involved in delivering and controlling blood flow going into the capillaries. And we have these precapillary sphincters we talked about before that are responsible for regulating that flow into the capillaries or constricting to prevent that flow. So before we mentioned the capillaries are the almost exclusive site of diffusion. Why? What features do capillaries have that enable this to occur? Well, for one, they're extremely narrow. Like I said, in some cases, a single cell at a time can fit through there. Very, very narrow. That narrowness narrowness causes the blood flow to slow down. And by doing that, that allows enough time for diffusion to happen, because diffusion isn't instant. It takes some time. Think about like a mail truck. A mail truck is zipping down the beltway at 70 miles per hour. It can't deliver mail. Instead, it gets off onto these narrower side roads with like one lane compared to 4 or more on the beltway. And those narrow lanes then allow or cause it to slow down. And then the mail can be exchanged with the houses. Additionally, capillaries are very, very thin. We said, 1 cell thick. Think about if you've ever lived in a house or an apartment where you can hear everything going on outside or with your neighbor next door. That's because there's thin walls. Such sound can pass through quickly and easily. Same is true with nutrients. If the walls are thin, they can pass through more easily than thick walls. And lastly, in most parts of the body, capillaries are extremely leaky, allowing fluid, gases, nutrients, etc. to go out and surround those cells, get into closer contact, allowing for easier diffusion. So ACV, arteries, capillaries, veins. Well, first, venules, essentially these small veins, are going to be collecting blood from the capillaries and bringing them back into the veins. So capillaries, in most cases, are going to reform into these venules. And this end that's closest to the capillaries is also fairly porous. So this is the only other spot where you have some diffusion or exchange of nutrients, wastes, the movement of red blood cells to get out of the bloodstream to help fight off infection. This can occur in that initial part of venules as well. But once they start moving more towards the veins, they're no longer porous. They get thicker, and that exchange can no longer occur. So as I mentioned then, a bunch of venules come together, and they then form veins. Veins have very, very, very low blood pressure, the lowest of all, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Because their blood pressure is so low, there needs to be some additional support to help to get that blood to continue to move back towards the heart. We'll talk about a few features, there are more, that help this. One of them is that unlike arteries and capillaries that do not have these features, veins have valves, just like in our heart, one-way doors. That means once blood pushes through those, it can't go back in the other direction, assuming those valves are working properly. Additionally, it's very hard to get blood from the lower half of the body back up towards the heart because it's pushed against gravity. At least the top half has gravity working in its favor, where the blood is getting pulled down. So your calf muscles here actually do a good job of squeezing, and they squeeze and push on these veins, like squeezing a tube of toothpaste, helping to push that blood back up towards the heart. That's why if you're on a long flight, they advise to get up and move around every once in a while to keep that blood circulating so it doesn't accumulate in the lower half of your body. Here's a quick question. Take a minute, pause the video, read through it, think about the answer. Okay, so previously we talked about 2 main components in a blood clot. This question is asking what is the protein involved in this process? Not the formed element. What is the protein involved? That protein is fibrin. The formed element, not a protein, involved, those are the platelets. Those are 2 main players here. We're going to go through the steps of blood flow from one part of the heart through the body and back again. I'm going to show you guys a short video of this, then we'll go through step by step. And again, you can use your phone camera to scan this QR code if you want to have the video accessible on your phone. I'd also recommend coming back to this picture here to refer to this as a nice diagram because you'll want to be familiar with this for testing purposes. So let's watch this short video.
How the blood flows in the heart. Beating on average 70 times per minute Each day the heart beats about 100,000 times. In the course of a 70-year lifetime, it will beat more than 2.5 billion times without ever pausing to rest. The cycle of blood flow is as follows. The right atrium receives blood from the great veins, the superior and inferior vena cava. Blood passes from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood is pumped through the pulmonary valve and pulmonary arteries to the lungs. In the lungs, carbon dioxide is removed from the blood and oxygen is picked up. Through the pulmonary veins, oxygenated blood returns to the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood passes through the mitral valve to the left ventricle. As the left ventricle contracts, the pressure closes the mitral valve. The aortic valve opens, allowing blood to leave the heart via the main blood vessel called the aorta. When this cycle of pumping is complete, the aortic valve closes to prevent blood from dropping back into the heart. The heart is two separate pumps that work together. Oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood is pumped around the body. Deoxygenated blood, which contains waste products, is returned to the lungs to allow the entire cycle to begin again.
So let's go ahead and let's diagram this out. So because blood flow is part of a circuit, a circle, there's no starting point. I tend to like to start with the right atrium. I don't know why, it's just where my mind starts it. But you can start wherever you want, because you always come back to the same spot. So if we start with the right atrium, where does blood go next? Well, each atria on top of the heart pumps straight down into the ventricles below. So right atrium pumps down into the right ventricle. The ventricles then pump blood up and out of the heart. When we say the ventricles are pumping up and out, it's not going back through the atria. That would be counterproductive. Instead, it's going up and out through arteries, going away from the heart. So the right side of the heart contains deoxygenated blood, blood low in oxygen. So where does it need to go to get that oxygen? The lungs. So to do that, it goes through the pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary arteries bring blood to the lungs. So arteries to capillaries, so the pulmonary capillaries, the lung capillaries. That's where diffusion happens. The blood picks up oxygen. Now it's got to come back to the heart. ACV, arteries, capillaries, veins. Pulmonary veins are bringing oxygenated blood back to the heart. Now it's not going to go back into the right side of the heart because that's got low oxygen levels. Instead, it's going into the left side of the heart, always back into the top chamber, the left atrium. That pumps straight down into the left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps up and out through the biggest artery in the body. The biggest artery is the aorta. The aorta then pumps blood out and around to a whole bunch of other smaller blood vessels. We'll call those the systemic arteries. Systemic arteries into the systemic or body-wide capillaries. Oxygen and nutrients are delivered, wastes are picked up. Now it's going to go back to the heart again through the systemic veins, all pooled together into the biggest veins in the body called the vena cava, and they bring blood back into the upper right chamber of the heart, the right atrium. So this is the complete pathway here, minus, many of the smaller blood vessels is the main pathway. You'll notice also these differences in color, red versus blue. That's indicating where blood would be deoxygenated and where it would be oxygenated. So once you're able to commit this pathway to memory, which believe me, you want to do, it's easy to know where it's oxygenated and deoxygenated. If you remember that the right side, the whole right side is deoxygenated, and the whole left side is oxygenated of the heart. Then once you know the pathway, the only spots it changes are going to be when you encounter capillaries. Capillaries are where the changes happen. In the pulmonary capillaries over here on the right, that's where the blood is picking up oxygen. So it goes from being low oxygen to high oxygen, deoxygenated to oxygenated. And then the systemic capillaries are the opposite. Oxygen is being delivered, and so it's going from high to low. So we'll talk about blood pressure in a little bit. Another measurement you can use to evaluate heart function is your pulse. You take your pulse by pressing on arteries. And there's various spots you can see over here in this diagram around the body where you can easily feel it. If there's an artery that's relatively close to a body surface or a hard tissue where you can kind of push it up against that, what you'll feel is the actual expanding of that artery wall, and then it's recoiling, going back to its normal state. That's the pulse as blood flows. At rest, for an adult, the normal heart rate is considered to be between 60 to 100, this would be beats per minute, BPM, beats per minute. Some athletes will have something closer to about 50 beats per minute, but this is normal. If you're above that at rest, that's considered high heart rate, and there are different possible reasons for that, some of them concerning, maybe some not. And we won't talk a lot about that, but know that between 60 to 100 is the typical, or 50 to 100 normal range. So now onto blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure. This is looking at blood pressure during systole. That's when the heart is contracting, when it's squeezing. So naturally, that's going to be the higher of the two blood pressure numbers, when the heart is actually squeezing or pumping blood. That's going to have an additional force on the artery walls. And then the diastolic pressure relates to diastole, when the heart is at rest. Or I use the word dozing. And that's the lower number of the two. There's a video you can watch if you want to scan this QR code to review blood pressure or go more into depth than I'm going to talk about. But that's just for your own interest. So as far as a healthy blood pressure, you want to have your systolic pressure number be below 120. It's a measurement of how many millimeters of mercury that records as the contraction and relaxation of those arteries, or the expansion and recoil of the arteries occurs. And their diastolic pressure to be less than 80. So those numbers are healthy if they're below those numbers. Less than 120, less than 80. If they're higher, you can have pre-hypertension, pre-high blood pressure, or high blood pressure, which is also just called hyper, meaning more, tension, referring to then pressure. And we'll talk about why high blood pressure, having readings of 140 over 90 or higher, or if either one of those is high, it can still be high blood pressure, is bad. Before we do that though, there are a number of things that can cause your blood pressure to change from what a normal reading would be. One of them is if you're not relaxed. You need to make sure you're relaxed, your feet are flat on the floor, you're not talking when you're having your blood pressure taken, you don't have a full bladder, that can add to that. Like I said, feet flat on the floor, you have a bare arm, you didn't have caffeine before that test, within 30 minutes of the measurement, alcohol, etc. So read through these and think about that next time you're getting your blood pressure taken. And also, readings can fluctuate rapidly by approximately 20 points in a matter of a few minutes, which is why a one-time reading, unless it's very extreme, is usually not concerning. It's if there's a pattern where your pressure is always high. Then you want to get it checked out and take some steps. So here's another link to, it's an interactive this time that you can go to and explore high blood pressure, hypertension. But here are reasons why it's bad. So blood pressure is measuring, again, how much force that blood is exerting or pushing on the artery walls. And if that force is always high, it can lead to damage of a variety of blood vessels and organs, leading to stroke, damage to your eyes, heart attack, etc. And also it can lead to reduced arterial elasticity. What that means is your arteries, normally like a pair of, pants with a stretchy band to them, with an elastic band, they can stretch out and then they kind of bounce back. But if you stretch them out too far, they might not be able to bounce back as much, and they'll stay stretched out. That can happen with your arteries as well. And so there's some major problems with this. It also means your heart is working harder. Your pressure is higher, your heart's having to work harder all the time, which could potentially lead to heart failure, which is different from heart attack. We'll talk about what a heart attack is in a little bit. Heart failure is when your heart starts to give out due to overwork. So what are some things that can increase your risk of hypertension? Well, one of them, of course, is lack of exercise, poor eating. There's a big genetic component to it as well, but also too much sodium. Too much sodium can increase your risk of hypertension by increasing water retention, which then causes higher blood pressure. And actually, most of the sodium we get does not come from our salt shaker. Instead, it comes from the foods that we get, either in restaurants or processed or canned foods that have a lot of sodium inside of them. And so you see here that we've got some chicken breast, some deli meat, even bread and chips have a lot of sodium, and most Americans eat way too much sodium. So to finish up here, let's talk about blood pressure and how it changes the further away you get from the main pumping source here. That main pumping source on the bottom here, that's the left ventricle. Left ventricle, remember, pumps blood out through the aorta, the biggest artery in the body. That transports blood then to all of the blood vessels and all of the cells all around the body. So the highest blood pressure in the body is in the aorta. Blood is going through there at high pressure, high speed. If that blood vessel breaks, you're literally dead in seconds. Sometimes you hear about an athlete who drops dead on a basketball court, otherwise seemed healthy. It's usually an aortic aneurysm, a rupture of the aorta, that then leads to almost instant death. From there, the aorta, it goes into a variety of other arteries. We'll call those any other arteries. In this list, I'm leaving off arterioles. Then into the capillaries. I'm also leaving off the venules from this list, so we won't worry about those. Any of the smaller veins, and then the biggest veins in the body, the vena cava, has the lowest pressure of all. So you'll want to know this order of pressure. In terms of testing purposes for any other arteries, I could put a name in front of it. I could say like the femoral artery, or I could say the renal artery. Those would fit into this category. And similar for veins, like say the jugular, etc. So think about those specific ones, they'd belong to this category, and then a variety of ones could belong in this category.